Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give everyone just a minute to come into the room, and then we'll get started. Thanks, everyone joining us. We're going to give it just a couple more seconds, another minute or so for people to sign in, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. This is Bradley Chalupsky, the voice behind the name, co-founder and editor-in-chief at Merchant Fraud Journal. Thanking you all for spending the time here with us. We have an amazing presentation here, conversation with some absolutely just wonderful fraud fighters who are going to be sharing a ton of knowledge and practical information for you. Just to get us started, the customer life cycle is something that we're increasingly seeing is the linchpin really of fraud prevention in our modern era. And so we wanted to go down to the expert level and really bring some expert knowledge on how you can fight fraud at every stage, and more importantly, how you can take a holistic view across the customer life cycle so that you can both fight fraud and provide those awesome customer experiences that are demanded of all of us. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to our guests, let them introduce ourselves. And thanks everyone again for joining.
Hey everyone, so I'll start off here. I'm Nader Masood. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at People. Excited to talk with the fellow panelists here, and I think we have an exciting conversation.
Awesome. I'm Corwin Cole. I'm co-founder, CTO, COO, and wearer of a lot of different hats at Approved. I've been in the industry for going on a decade now, and definitely excited to share some really important anecdotes with you guys.
Everybody, Sean Colpitz, Senior Fraud Investigator for JustEatTakeaway.com's Global Fraud Operation Team. And just like everybody else on the panel, looking forward to sharing some insights with everyone here.
And Bradley has already introduced himself. So I guess the goal for today is really just to talk about the customer journey and some of the fraud risks that happen along the way. And then from there, go into continuous adaptive trust and why that's important, and looking at the customer journey holistically, and then obviously touch on balancing customer experience and fraud prevention. So everyone's familiar with the whole idea of total cost of fraud now, right? I think the industry has evolved with looking at fraud at just beyond just what's chargebacks or the lost value of the item. That's just a very top level piece of it. And when we're looking at cost of fraud and chargeback rates, but there's a whole iceberg underneath just that dollar amount that constitutes as the cost of fraud that we as practitioners should really be mindful and aware of. So the top part is chargebacks. And then the next section of the iceberg we just call the total cost of fraud. So that's everything for operational inefficiencies, everything. And then the bottom part, which is probably the most important part, is the lost lifetime value of customers. And when customers have bad experiences, they go elsewhere, and they tell their friends and family about what a terrible experience they had, and that fraud attempt for them just snowballs into such a larger effect.
Yeah, it's really hard to get the entire value of what it actually costs a business. There's so many different elements that are really hard to monetize and put a dollar sign behind because you just don't know the entire effect that it's had on you.
Yeah, and it gets trickier and trickier all the time. And sort of the biggest initial driver of the fact that there is this gigantic iceberg underneath the water lurking here is the fact that fraud just gets trickier and trickier all the time. And so we've seen, a rise in really sinister types of fraud, like triangulation, for example, that have really been surging since COVID. And just triangulation by itself creates a lot of incredible difficulties and inefficiencies that live below the water here.
Yeah, and with the ATO surge that's going on, all the brand damage that's being done, how do you put a number to that?
Yeah.
I mean, even at the top part of fraud, I think CyberSource came out with a report pretty recently, and they said 3% of all e-commerce revenue would lost to payment fraud globally, and that was actually up from a couple of years ago where it's 2.4. So even that top of the iceberg is growing, and that just kind of exasperates the fact that the top of the iceberg is growing, they're just melting, and the bottom is also getting bigger too. So not only is the bottom part just like a lot bigger than top, but it's also expanding and growing as well too. In terms of other like lifetime value of customers, I think another thing to mention there is everything's become a commodity nowadays, right? Like especially online, you can buy any item from a multitude of sources, whether it's Amazon, whether it's direct, whether it's third-party resellers. So because everything is so commoditized, is as a retailer, you have to differentiate yourself, and how do you differentiate yourself? It's based off of customer experience, right? So having that customer experience it should be top of mind as well too, because with everything going on and everything going digital, the shifting in digital transformation, your customer experience becomes a competitive advantage.
Yeah, and we've even seen the conveniences and the kind of wide availability of different options for where you can purchase the same product. You can get like a say like a Nike brand product at a lot of different places, Amazon, Nike, eBay, etc. And we've seen fraudsters start to take advantage of all that convenience by doing fraud where they'll attempt to defraud the brand directly, and if that doesn't work, then they'll go do the exact same attempt for the same product at an authorized retailer of said brand. And so there is this kind of cascading continual brand erosion where, if a legitimate customer gets kind of rejected and then they go get the same thing from Amazon, then, it's a really, really, really sticky customer addiction at Amazon.
Yeah, that's actually a good point that you mentioned, because when especially with brand erosion, right? Even if a customer goes to a third-party website and buys a product there or has a bad experience there, is your brand that's ultimately responsible for that too, right? So really ensuring every even with wholesale, who you work with, channel partners, everything is safe and secure. It should be top of mind.
Yeah, these fraudsters, they don't care so much about the customer experience. They just care about a term that I've heard about quite a lot recently being thrown around the industry. It's the path of least resistance for them, right? I believe in that to a point. It's not necessarily the path of least resistance. It's the path of least resistance with the greatest return. So if they're having problems on your platform, they will, just like a customer who's having any issues, just jump to another one and procure whatever goods that they're after, the easiest way possible.
Yeah, the other side of that is if you sell high enough ticket stuff, you'll get very persistent, dedicated fraudsters who have a plan for what happens if you resist their first attempt. Yeah,
and then it's a tough problem, because even when you manually review items, I think even in that same CyberSource report, they say like 20% manually reviewed orders are declined, and that means, what about the other 80%, right? That are approved. So you have, again, going back to the customer experience, even if you do have all those operational inefficiencies that kind of go into that middle bucket of the total cost of fraud, it leads to that lifetime value of the customer as well, potentially, or losing lifetime value of the customer.
Yeah, but no one wants to be manually reviewing orders, which touches right on what we're going into. How if we can put protective measures and detections in place along the customer journey, then hopefully by the time you get near the end, you won't have to review anything.
Agreed. Moving on, I think you mentioned the customer journey. I think every step of the customer journey requires trust, right? From the moment you open up an account to every time you have, every time you log in from different places as well too, whether details to account changes, whether that's an email address or updating a shipping address to checkout. And now we've seen a lot of fraud attempts in guest checkout as well too. That's been a rising point of concern for a lot of people, as well as policy abuse and returns as well.
Yeah, especially on the account opening stage. The branded credit cards get targeted by a lot of the most kind of tricky, dedicated, and resourceful fraudsters. And so people who do identity theft and therefore can answer challenge questions, such as like last four of cardholder social. It's quite easy if you're a little bit skilled at identity theft to defeat questions like that. And so we've seen, branded credit cards suffering the fact that, they try to implement convenience services to, create a great customer experience, but that leads to fraudsters discovering that they can add a new address that is the correct billing address as far as the bank is concerned on a credit card that they've compromised. And so now, some mule that they've recruited can use their personal address with somebody else's credit card entirely. And the bank says ABSY. And so that's just a huge problem. And we've had even instances where, someone who obviously stole somebody else's identity and is using a like branded credit card for sort of high-end electronics has placed like 10 different orders today, all requesting next day shipping on like quantity more than one of high-end drones. And then, we sort of push back to our merchant, they push back to the bank, and then the bank says, okay, we'll put a freeze and call the customer. And then they end up calling the merchant back and saying, okay, we verified everything with the customer and raised the credit limit again. And it's just a deeply toxic and destructive strategy because it defeats almost every check that there is against it.
Yeah, and in the e-commerce landscape, there's not always the necessity to verify an identity, right? That you want speed, you want people to get in, get their orders. So when it comes to account creation, a lot of times there's limited securities around it, and that makes it very easy for fake accounts to be created, right? And then be used for fraudulent purposes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Talking about the kind of hidden costs as well, I'm sure we're all familiar with card testing, people just kind of spamming random, potentially valid credit card numbers. But what might end up happening, we had a customer who uses Google AdSense. And so every card tester attempt that did actually coincidentally land on a valid credit card would register as a completed checkout. And so then Google AdSense would start pouring marketing spend into retargeting those same customers. And then those customers would come back because they're card testers. And so Google AdSense thinks, I'm just killing it. I am absolutely closing every sale to the same person over and over and over and over. And it got to the point where I think more than half of all their marketing spend was being poured into entire countries where they literally had never had a legitimate customer before. So
yeah, and you'll see an account opening. Now you'll see an account opening and account creation. A lot of times there's a lot of limited information coming in on the back end as well for your detection and prevention methods. It's a portion that doesn't seem to have a lot of concern in the e-commerce world because they want that speed, right? So really when it comes to account opening, there are some certain things that you should necessarily check. And, as much as you don't want friction, I am a firm believer when it comes to account opening, absolutely MFA, right? Verify your phone number, verify your email address if you can. Even risk-based MFA, if you want to allow some expedition for some of your clientele, based on what kind of risk senses you're getting in your scoring features, push MFA if they reach a certain threshold there, or even stagger it. There's one instance of a company that I actually used as a client. And I went, created my account, and immediately upon my first order at account creation, they had me verify my phone number. That's cool. By the time I wanted to place my third order, I would have to verify my email address. So they sent me an email verification to my address. And then just prior to my third order, like after my second order, sorry, they then sent it a reminder that I still need to verify my email address in order to place my third and final order. And then at the third order point, not verifying the email address, I was not able to place the order until I verified my email. They told me, let me know, I verified my email and I was ready to go. So giving that time actually for myself, it made the experience feel a little bit better because I didn't have that pressure. Although I tested the system to see what was going on because of what I do, it was nice to have just that freedom of a little ways to actually verify everything. And I see that as limiting the friction a little bit for the customers there.
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to limit friction at every step too, right? Especially right off the bat. Account opening is typically one of the first interactions you have with the consumer. So limiting friction there, and I think you mentioned it, Sean, and you called it risk-based MFA, or I think there's so many different terminologies for it now. But really kind of automating that step first, right? You want a high top of funnel, quick, easy couple of checks as well too, just to make sure, hey, is this person okay? Before moving on, and then kind of adjusting the risk experience along the way as well too. Is important too. So that leads to the next point, login, right? So a consumer creates an account. You after you check in, but there could be a fraud attempt that happen along the way. With account takeover specifically, we see that a lot at the point of login. Now with the rise of all these data breaches and hacks, credential stuffing has just become so commonplace, where on the dark web you can buy thousands of identities or thousands of credentials for a couple of dollars, right? So looking here, there's a couple really good ways to kind of solve it. I think, but before, people will just look at IP and device as well too. But I think we can take it a step further. A lot of behavioral analytics solutions at the point of login could be very beneficial.
Yeah, certainly doing stuff like continual behavioral biometrics and analytics all throughout the customer journey, and using like device ID, for example, to confirm that somebody visited your site a week ago maybe, and then they came back and all their behavior has been very organic. And so maybe you can just kind of up the threshold a little bit to push back some of the MFA to maybe just the next order, as opposed to the first one, make it on the second one, because you have all these other sort of behind the scenes trust signals. And that can really reduce a lot of friction with fair reliability, because it's difficult and slow to defeat device ID and behavioral biometrics as a fraudster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you see at account login, that's like you said, you're there. That's when ATOs are prime, right? So you'll see your typical indicators that everyone's aware of, right? IP velocity thresholds being broken with login attempts. Certain domains being used, user agents and whatnot, just really showing themselves. However, now what we also have problems with is that mix of that bot and human interaction in order to circumvent login protections. And that's something that slows that velocity down, makes it a little bit harder to see. And these abilities to revolve IP addresses, have 3, 4, 5 attempts and then change to another IP address, automatically. That also helps them negate detection. It's getting harder and harder to do. You have to start looking behind the scenes. You really have to spot those patterns. For example, are they working from a list? Are you seeing, say, the letter B popping up a whole bunch of times, followed by the letter C? Also, look a little bit deeper. People are always looking at simple things like the IP address, right? Comes to mind right away. Look a little bit deeper. See that user agent. See what browser versions they're using. Are they using a much older browser version? Is that popping up on your radar? There's a lot of other indicators that you can see behind the scenes that allow you to not have to introduce friction to your customers. Definitely something that I would recommend is using the data to help protect them. Has the device and user agent been seen in the last little while upon those accounts? Lots of different things. Has the account not been accessed for 2 years and all of a sudden it's being accessed? Just things to put into your machine learning or scoring or anything that you have for your detection and prevention measures to say that this might be an ATO.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that, to stay apprised of different fraud trends, because fraudsters constantly evolve, right? I know a lot of people use MFA at this stage as well too, but then we've seen the rise of SIM swaps again too. So they could get past you even at the point of login, which is why you again want to keep monitoring and track throughout the whole journey. So even at the point where account changes, right? When a customer is about to make an order and then they update the shipping address, right? That's obviously another point that you want to check. Or you go in and you see they update the email address, so the receipt goes to them, right? Account changes is another key part of the transaction that you can monitor to really lower fraud rate.
Yeah, account changes should be reviewed, the same way like a transaction is reviewed. Just consider them events that need some kind of scrutiny, I think.
Yeah, basically looking at this customer journey here, these first 3 touch points that we're speaking on, those are the ones where, in my opinion, that's where MFA may come into play, right? You have account opening. Basically, you want to make sure the person is who they say they are, to the point that you're able to, with the information they provide and you're able to verify. At login, you don't want to do it at every point, right? Risk-based, I would recommend there as well. Are they setting off flags going on? And then account changes. Those are 3 points where you may want to apply friction. Of course, you don't have to, but account changes, if someone wants to change their phone number, perhaps verify their email at that time. If they want to change their email address, perhaps verify their phone number. And again, it could be risk-based as well. Like, do they look suspicious? Like it could be an ATO or some of your flags going off, some of those indicators that were mentioned previously. Do they look suspicious? If so, push MFA. If not, then feel free to let it through if you wish.
Yeah. And then at the point of checkout as well too, right? Well, we talked a little bit earlier about customer experience, and part of that customer experience and digital transformation has been making purchases a lot easier, including one-click checkout, having stored card in there for the next purchase. But one of the biggest challenges that we've seen recently is guest checkout. Right. I think Corbin talked about car testing a little bit earlier too. Guest checkout has just been rising for a multitude of factors. Sometimes people just don't want to input their information. There's a distrust to having their information out there. So a lot of good users are going through guest checkout as well. It's not just fraudulent users as well.
Yeah, we all know that, if checkout takes a few seconds longer than it could, then that's already bad news for your conversion rate. So, people doing guest checkout is pretty intuitive because it just doesn't really take as long. But one of the big things about guest checkout is, again, that it's confounded massively by triangulation fraud. Because with guest checkout, we know, as we've discussed, device ID, email address, IP address, phone number, and so on, all identifying data points that can be linked between orders so that you can see, did this device place another order earlier? Did this email place another order last year, and so on. Get really confused by triangulation fraud, because triangulation fraud usually includes almost every real data point belonging to a real customer who is not a fraudster, and only the email and credit card don't belong to that person. And usually they're actually like a real customer of your brand. They probably went to eBay looking for your brand and then inadvertently bought something at a slight discount from some store that had all kinds of positive reviews. And it just turns out that when they buy that thing from eBay, the person who runs the eBay store is going to go direct to your website and then have you ship to them. And so they'll give you the eBay customer's real name, real address, real phone number, and then they'll use an IP address that is, some kind of generic Verizon wireless located near their house or something, and an email address that can take on a whole bunch of different forms. And we've seen a lot of different tactics in choosing emails in triangulation. But what that means is if you do correctly deny an order with, say, the correct phone number for John Doe on one particular event, and that was triangulation where John Doe placed an order through eBay, but then you correctly declined it. Next time, if John Doe tries to order from you directly and you see that previous decline linked to the phone number as negative history, you might end up now rejecting the real customer, even though they just unwittingly tried to buy one of your products from a fake eBay store and then came back to your store directly to try to buy it again.
Yeah. And the next step too with policy abuse, right? Policy abuse can take so many different forms. There's promo abuse, loyalty refunds, and return, and even just user generated content like reviews on sites and stuff as well too, that all kind of constituted as policy abuse that you want to protect yourself from. But one of the big trends that's been on the rise here has been refund fraud, and some of that is friendly fraud, and some of the legitimate fraudsters.
Yeah, sometime last year, we discovered that refund as a service fraud was really on the rise. And so if you imagine you bought a 4K TV from some place that sells electronics, and then sometime later you just decided that you really wished you had gotten that TV for free instead of having paid for it, then you could just Google, how to get my Samsung TV for free, and you would find posts by people who offer their services as refund fraudsters. They'll essentially take a cut of the refund that you're getting, and in exchange they have a lot of experience doing refunds with particular merchants, and so they list them as their top ones that you can use their services to get refunds from, and they basically just take 20% of your refund and you pocket the rest.
Yeah, one of our favorite musical fraudsters, Bob, Bob's refund manual is out there, for download. You can actually, it's funny because they actually show you how to defraud Amazon, and you can buy it on Amazon for $40.
Yeah, no, it's also a thin line between what we call the traditional friendly fraud and organized fraud, right? Like Corwin mentioned, there's groups out there that are doing this. They're just taking a cut, and they're doing this for anyone. So really differentiating between like friendly fraud and these types of return frauds is important too.
One of the good things about policy abuse is basically you get to determine when it becomes abuse. So when you set that threshold or criteria of if customer meets XYZ, then they are abusing vouchers or promos or refunds. So really, when you think about that criteria, you have to really think okay, what am I going to do once someone hits that criteria? Once an account hits that criteria, a connected network or feature or whatever meets that criteria, what are we going to do? Are we going to prevent them altogether and lose the business? Are we just going to not allow vouchers or promos on these accounts anymore? Are we not going to allow refunds on these accounts anymore? What do we want to do? And the good thing about you setting the criteria is you can always make sure that your criteria follows something that your system is able to do, or develop your system to make sure that you can act on that criteria that you necessarily need. Not that you want, but that you're going to need. It should be rather simple to put into place because you determine what that is. You define it.
Yeah. Another piece there is even with user generated content and reviews and stuff as well too. When people go to your site or go to a site and look at reviews, they expect the reviews to be trusted, right? If you go, you see a review and you know you can often tell where when a product has farmed reviews, then you just don't trust it, even though the product may be good. It may be a legitimate product. It doesn't have to be a fraudulent seller or anything. But when you see all these farmed reviews, that immediately loses trust for the consumer. So keeping all that in mind as well too. And then I think post-transaction, we talked a little bit about it. There's many different stages of what a post-transaction looks like. It could be after the card went through and you want to just change something on it or return fraud as well too. So really looking at the journey holistically is as opposed to just individual points, is where we should be focusing our efforts at. So even if we go to the next slide, we have to start thinking about the customer journey holistically, right? With continuous adaptive trust, like I said, like an IP or a login might be a legitimate login, but then there might be a man-in-the-middle attack or something that session interrupted that we should we need to be aware of. So like standard fraud prevention methods just aren't necessarily enough anymore, right? Instead of just looking at one, like when you look at an account change, for example, you're just looking at it at one specific point of time rather than looking at the whole journey. Is this legitimate or not?
Yeah, I think the goal is to, the customers can get around this entire loop almost every time with no friction. And beyond that, for all the use cases where you do need a little bit of friction to engage in some sort of public service opportunity to help someone out who maybe their card got compromised or their identity got compromised or something. Those things all individually as categorical events, calling a customer, for example, should happen. They should just happen a lot less frequently as you make progress in kind of doing this stuff right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. There are some points, like you said, Corwin, where it's necessary. Just try and keep it down to a minimum. Really be sure that those are the times that you have to do so. We want this customer experience to just flow for the customer, which is why a lot of the things that we've spoken about, things that we've observed or things that we could use as fraud fighters, they're in the background. The customer doesn't actually have to do anything, but use their account and make their transaction. We're able to detect by using identifiers that we can see behind the scenes just with the information that's being supplied.
Yeah, and go ahead.
It's important to know not only your customers and what's unusual for them, and to have kind of a connection to them to be able to sense when something is changing in the world, maybe because you're targeted by new fraudsters or just something is changing about the consumer cycle. But the different types of fraud that target you as well. So we have some merchants who we work with who they only sell almost exclusively kind of gigantic, heavy machinery type equipment. And so they don't get a lot of fraud, but the fraudsters who do target them are very tricky. And they've worked out an entire plan to deal with the logistics of, accepting freight that requires a forklift to actually get off the truck. And so the more sophisticated fraudsters have things like networks of mules set up, and their job is basically to place orders with their own cards and ship something locally, or place orders with cards that were handed to them and ship something locally, but then otherwise try to always pose as a legitimate person. And so these are people who didn't really get in on the fraud side. They got recruited by the fraud side. And so they behave quite differently as well. And it's possible for like a veteran fraud manager to have never seen some of the more obscure types of fraud if they kind of sort of move from like a very business to consumer product to a more like business to small business product, like pressure washers.
Yeah, I think we talked about earlier the concept of customer experience. So we're moving on to the next slide. When we're talking about earlier, we talked about kind of the importance and the financial impact of having customer experience, but then there's also just the reputational impact as well too. It's really something that I think everyone's taking a lot more seriously with everything going digital now, is really balancing customer experience. Customer experience is probably taking the front to fraud prevention in many ways as well too, where people are prioritizing having good experience over some fraud losses.
Yeah, and there are sometimes important opportunities to touch with people who you can give a good experience to that is a little bit tangential to the standard customer experience. For example, sometime late last year, we saw a fraud attempt for a compromised identity, which was an account opening fraud, a branded credit card that was used to order a $1,000 e-gift card right before Christmas. For someone who it didn't really make much sense for that person to be using the credit card belonging to the identity that they used. So we looked into it, and it became quite obvious on a deep dive that this was a case of identity theft, and that this elderly lady in Arizona had her identity stolen by a guy who had like 2 prior arrests for identity theft. And so I let my contact at our merchant know at this automotive company, and she said, "Oh, not on my watch." And so she, responded to my email, said, "Thanks for letting me know. Do you have phone numbers for this lady whose identity got compromised?" And ended up calling her and explaining to her that her identity was stolen, and here's what she needs to do to actually start to mitigate the problem. And it's probably going to be very painful. And it was just a very important sort of public service touch point more than a customer touch point, but certainly helps to solidify the reputation of the brand.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, this is moving on to the next slide. This is where we have the idea of trust versus risk as well too, and really you want to start looking for trust as opposed to just looking for fraud and risk. So if we move on to the next slide, solving if you solve the identity fraud problem, you solve the fraud problem, right? So this is the kind of the idea of looking for trust and not just fraud. And right now, I think we've been so predispositioned to look for fraud and look for risk, right? When we train machine learning models or even manual reviewing stuff, we're aiming to look at fraud or at risk to see what's fraudulent and what not, as opposed to looking for what's trust and what's trustworthy. I mean, I think going back to that, MRC has a stat, and even the cyber source, where only 2 to 3% of orders are fraudulent, right? What about the other 97 as well too? We have to keep that in mind. Majority of your customers are legitimate customers, so look for those trusted transactions and not just for fraudulent transactions.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind just the staggering numbers issue, that there are 100 times ish more legitimate orders than there are fraud attempts. And so there are also 100 times more edge cases and weird nuances to legitimate orders. And so it's really important to identify who placed the order and just figure out whether they're trustworthy. That's what I teach my reps internally. All of our reviewers take the approach of figuring out who it was who actually went to check out or called over the phone to place the order. And as long as that person is not a fraudster, there's just almost no way the order is fraud. And that's a good approach. But it comes with some difficulties. You have to actually know your customers really well. So, for example, if you have customers who are like software developers or firearm enthusiasts, or they are like career military, then you're going to see a lot of anonymized and or encrypted email addresses, a lot of VPNs, a lot of devices that defeat device ID. And those things are all going to look like risk signals at first, but if you know your customers well enough, you can contextualize and kind of make sure that you're trying to identify them as opposed to just reacting to the appearance of risk.
Yeah, and then that also, if you start flagging, or declining negative or a good transaction, that leads to a lot of false negatives, bad customer experience and stuff as well too, which is, can be avoided by, again, knowing who your customer is, knowing that identity behind that, and again, looking for trust signals as opposed to just, risk fraud signals. Because if you look at fraud signal, you can find fraud signals and everything, and you're just going to be declining everything, right?
Yeah, when you do your analyses, like you have to look at both sides, right? You have to see what the fraud is going on, and you have to see, what are the genuine customers doing as well to weigh against that, especially if you don't want false positives, right? You have to see what the good side is doing as well. Look at those trustworthy customers, see their patterns and behaviors as well. So, if this is what it's looking like, then this is a good person. This is a customer that we can trust. Using all those different data points in the background, everything that they supply upon their account, even using what you can, their ordering patterns, everything. That way, when the anomalies happen, you're like, wait a minute, this is an indicator that maybe I should trust.
Agreed. I mean, with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for some really, really great insights into this. We do have one question, which is, do you recommend any tools or systems to provide supplemental data to your original order analysis? Anyone? Meaning, but which tools within the platform are you looking at to help you get at additional insights into these different types of problems at each stage in the life cycle? Like, what are you guys looking at when you're inside the platform that's helping you to make those additional decisions?
I mean, I can start this one off. I think one of is identity information, right? I mean, we just kind of touched on the importance of knowing who the customer is, and moving on beyond just looking at a device or an email address, just looking at the identity as a whole. That would be beneficial.
Yeah, certainly zooming out from the entire story of the order rather than sort of fixating on one or a few small number of data points is really important. You can often see things like, if you just watch the behavioral biometrics replay, then a whole bunch of risk signals can all simultaneously resolve because there's just an incredible amount of slow organic movement and reviewing the checkout and so on. And so I really recommend having lots of different types of data. So you should have email intelligence, IP intelligence, phone intelligence, address intelligence, device ID, JavaScript in the browser, behavioral biometrics, and all kinds of different things. And if you ever encounter the opportunity to add a new type of data, so for example, behavioral data is different from email intelligence, I strongly recommend adding a new type of data, because combining them all together is by far the most robust approach.
Yeah, and when it comes to the data, you really have to, in that instance, you do need the manual element at some point, right? You're going to need that analysis of what this data is actually showing. So really think of the scenarios. Like you've seen the good customers and what they're doing. You've seen the bad guys and what they're doing. Okay, what looks different amongst them? What are those signals that you're seeing? And look at everything you've got. Corwin mentioned a lot of different information that you should have at your fingertips already. And if you don't, you should probably get it. you're going to need as much data as possible, and get as minute as possible, like as minuscule as possible with the details, and have it very, very organized. That's very important. A lot of information that's stored, different people have stored it for different reasons and different purposes. Organize it. And if you can't organize the entire thing, make it smaller. Put it into buckets that you need. For example, say you're using a data warehouse, right? Create your own tables, put it together so that it suits your needs, so that you don't have to keep sourcing or aggregating from multiple sources. You just have it together for your purposes. And it's going to probably be a lot, but again, when it comes down to it, different types of fraud require different types of data that you will be looking at, right? And as we've discussed this entire time, the entire customer journey, what are you seeing across it?
I actually have a follow-up question on that, which is when you're taking these analyses, you're taking this data, you're making analysis, where are you guys drawing the line, making the decisions about how wide or how myopic to go? Because on the one hand, we have each of these stages in the journey, and each of them have their traditional red flags, and we can look at each of them individually and try to make a determination that something at this stage, it does not look right. At the same time, as we've discussed, when you're taking that full picture, you can get a better sense of what the whole order looks like. And that can also be insightful or instructive. So where are you making the line to say, I'm going to emphasize the big picture more, or I'm going to emphasize this individual stage more? Is it by the type of red flag that you see? Is it the type of order? Are you looking at maybe patterns, some combination of all of that? But how are you making those determinations?
Yeah, it's straight up all of that, Brad. Especially the patterns, right? Because we're human. We fall into patterns. We source them out. It's why we see faces in the clouds, right? We're built for it. So fraudsters fall into patterns as well. So their activity will be similar. Granted, there may be some subtle variances here and there until they create their next scheme because you prevented them. But you'll find those patterns. Are they copying and pasting this data? And if they're finding success doing it, well, they're going to keep doing it until something's put in place, right? They're not going to break from it. So there's your pattern. You're grabbing information from different sources. If you're looking into your refund abuse, you're going to want, their order history. You're going to want their refund history, their card history. And then you're also going to want to look and see if there's activity that's similar to that across your network, right? Connected accounts that share some of those same details. It can get pretty big, but really when you think about it, I'm going to drop a quote from my buddy Alexander Hall here. Think like a fraudster, right? If I was a fraudster, what would I do? And just gather the data based on what you think you would do and see if it's happening. Probably about 50% of the time it's going to be happening, and the other 50% of the time it's going to end up happening if you don't have anything in place.
All right.
Yeah.
We have another question here about implementing two-factor authentication on new accounts, or to make account changes or purchases. Now, we touched on this a little bit, but I do think that this is a really important topic, because in my non-fraud fighting life, certainly 2FA is being pushed everywhere, and you're supposed to lock everything down. And I know that for me, who is very conscious of security and uses strong passwords, uses a password manager, changes passwords up, the 2FA, I know it's best practice, and admittedly, I don't always do it, because it can be very, very, very friction heavy to do it, even on things that you should be doing it. So I'm interested to hear from you guys what or how you're going about measuring the amount of friction that you're creating with these types of methods, whether they're biometric, whether they're kind of apps in your phone, whatever you're doing to create that 2FA experience. and how you make the determination if the benefit is worth the risk from the friction that you're creating.
Yeah, I can take this or start this one. So with 2FA, I mean, the reason why it's so effective is because it does have that added friction. It is more work for the fraudster. If a fraudster wanted to get around it, they could, right? Like it's fairly like I mentioned earlier, sim swaps, right? Like there's easy enough ways to get around it if necessary. But the point is also to you want to make it not worth it for them to do it, right? Make it too cumbersome, too expensive. If there's no ROI there for the fraudster, they're not going to do it. So I think when looking, that's one important way to kind of balance that too, is what is determining what that level where the too expensive for the fraudster, but not too cumbersome for your users. And as well as I think 2FA it's good if you're trying to stop a specific type of fraud too, right? That's something else. It's not good for everything. It's not worth doing 2FA on every account opening or every login attempt and everything. But if there is a targeted type of challenge that you want to solve, 2FA can solve that. But doing it on everything, that's where the friction kind of comes in.
Yeah, I think Sean mentioned earlier the sort of process of, at account opening, you don't necessarily need to verify the second factor, but before first checkout, maybe verify the second factor unless you have, some other things behind the scenes that can help you feel safe without needing to do that step. And then, by the third order, maybe verify another factor like an email address. That follows a pattern of essentially understanding where your risk actually lies. If you are trying to use 2FA to stop, a very, very, very minuscule percentage of low ticket first order type fraud, then it might not even be worth it because it's just such a small problem that there's no risk of it snowballing out of control. So try to think very carefully about what 2FA is accomplishing, exactly how it's accomplishing it at every step that you implement it, and then do you need it by that point, or are you still pretty safe despite not being perfect in your performance up to that point?
Well, I think we've had a great conversation here, guys. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And I think we'll call it a wrap. So I'll let you guys tell everyone where they can find you on the web, and if they want to get in touch with you personally, ask any questions or anything, and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, so people.com, check us out. And my LinkedIn is just my name, Nader Masood, LinkedIn / Nader Masood.
Yeah, you can also find me on LinkedIn or just go to approved.com, APRUVD.
Yeah, for myself, you can find me on LinkedIn, The Fraudalist, FRAUDELIST. Email, if you want to shoot me one, is thefraudalist at shaw.ca. And I look forward to hearing from everybody. And I want to thank personally the panel, very, very insightful gentlemen. It was really well done. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining. We'll be sending out a copy to everyone in the coming days. And we hope we'll see you again for our next events. And make sure to visit the website, merchantfraudjournal.com, for all the latest news and information to help you keep those fraudsters at bay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day or evening.